Audible is my road trip companion.
It's kind of my quiet alone time.
Audible is a routine for me.
It's like a fun night school for adults.
I could easily be seduced into locking myself in a place where I do nothing but listen to books.
I never was interested in historical fiction before, but I'm obsessed with it now.
There are a lot of classic and big titles that I feel like I've missed out. Since I don't have time to read, might as well listen.
If I want to catch up on the news or history or learn what's going on in the world, I can download a book and listen to it.
Because I listened to her story over and over again, I made the decision to go ahead and follow my own dream, which was to help other veterans.
I think there's 180 books in my library now. It changes your perspective. It makes you a different person. It's true. It's so true.
Download Audible and start listening today.
Hello and welcome. I'm Elena Morgan. I teach history here at USC with a focus on race and ethnicity, mass incarceration, Black intellectual history, Islam in America, and Black international movements. Thanks everybody for tuning in to the 25th Annual Festival of Books and our virtual presentation entitled, Who Gets to Be Citizens in the Land of the Free? Presented by USC. Joining us for our discussion of the historical and contemporary obstacles faced by marginalized communities in the US, as well as the paths towards freedom and empowerment, are a panel of experts in law, history, and social work. Sam Erman is a scholar of law and history, whose research and teaching focuses on citizenship, the Constitution, race, and legal change. Ariela Gross is the John B. and Alice R. Sharp Professor of Law and History and the co-director of the Center for Law, History, and Culture at USC. And Kristen Zaleski is an associate professor of social work and director of forensic mental health at the Keck Human Rights Clinic. Before we get into our conversation, I just want to remind everybody to support your local independent bookstores during this festival, but you can also order these authors' books via the LA Times bookshop page. Sam, Ariela, and Kristen, welcome. I'm so excited to be having this conversation with all three of you. And I just wanted to start out with introductions. If everybody could please just introduce yourselves, and we'll start with Sam.
Great. My name is Sam Erman, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, Ariela? Yeah.
I'm Ariela Gross. It's a pleasure to be joining all three of you for this discussion of our new books.
And Kristen is the last one.
Hi, I'm Kristen Zaleski, and I'm honored to sit alongside Ariela and Sam to discuss the books and have this important conversation tonight.
So I've asked each one of our panelists to prepare something very short about what they would like you to know about their projects. So so let's get started with Sam. If you could introduce us to your topic and your book and the arguments that you're making, that would be fantastic.
Well, thank you. My book is Almost Citizens, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Constitution, and Empire, and it seeks to address this puzzle. How did the world's oldest and preeminent democracy, the United States, become home to the planet's oldest colony, Puerto Rico? Puerto Rico came to the United States during the 1898 war with Spain, when the United States invaded and then annexed the island. And my book makes several interrelated arguments about what followed. The first is just what happened, a big change between 1898 and 1925. So for 3 decades prior to 1898, US annexations had come to a hard stop. The reason was the Civil War and the constitutional regime that emerged from it, which did lots of things, but among them was slow down empire by requiring that all Americans other than American Indians be citizens, that full constitutional rights extend as far as US borders, and that all US lands other than Washington, D.C., one day at least, become states. The change was that by 1925, none of these three pieces of legal conventional wisdom remained true. So, who was responsible? It turns out this legal change was distributed across and beyond the federal government. It took place outside of courts as often as within them. It involved presidents, lawmakers, bureaucrats, members of the bar, and private individuals. So how did it happen? Creative ambiguity, evasion, and incrementalism were the key tools for this change. Dicta, minority opinions, narrow holdings, ambiguous logic, underdefined terms, concessions, signals, even the new doctrinal categories that were invented, the unincorporated territory of Puerto Rico, the non-citizen national, non-fundamental constitutional rights were hard to parse. Throughout, a powerful undertow of racism shaped and animated the legal arguments, with Puerto Rico often cast as a woman or as a child in the US family. A key context here was the ongoing US struggle with the legacy of the Civil War. In telling all of this, I take a narrative approach. I tell the story through several remarkable Puerto Ricans who sought US citizenship, and then also through their federal interlocutors. And on one level, the protagonists all failed. For 20 years or so, the US withheld citizenship from Puerto Ricans whom they deemed unfit to hold it. And then Congress finally gave Puerto Rican citizenship, but only after young Felix Frankfurter, the future Supreme Court Justice, assured lawmakers that doing so would bring islanders no rights and no eventual statehood. Now, Frankfurter underestimated citizenship, which brought Puerto Ricans the freedom to migrate within the United States, so that today more US citizens of Puerto Rican descent live off the island and on it. But Frankfurter was partly right. Liberation did not follow citizenship. Indeed, if we peek forward, Puerto Rico remains unincorporated. It has a tenuous hold on self-government and constitutional rights. Harms to Puerto Ricans from racism, associations with foreignness, and lack of federal voting rights remain glaring. And many of these harms are also still constitutional.
Thank you so much, Sam. Ariela, can you tell us about your book?
Yes, thank you so much, Elena. My book, Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana, is co-authored with Alejandro de la Fuente, a historian of Cuba. And the book tells, first of all, it's a much earlier history than Sam's. We start in the 16th century when the enslavement of Africans first began in Cuba. And our book tells the story of enslaved people who took advantage of openings in the law to claim freedom for themselves and their families. The book is a legal history, but we focus on the way ordinary people made claims on legal institutions and participated in legal processes that shaped and created regimes of race. So it's really a bottom-up history of law and race and racism. And the question we're asking in the book is, why is it that in all three of these places, colonists from Spain, from Britain, from France, all begin by putting into place in the law distinctions based on race, equating African descent with degradation and enslaved status. In fact, even earlier in Havana than in New Orleans and in Virginia. But by 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, they look totally different. A free person of color in Havana could be part of public life, but in Louisiana and in Virginia, whiteness and citizenship have become so closely interlinked that a free man of color or woman of color is almost entirely excluded from public life. So why did that happen in Louisiana and Virginia and not in Cuba? And our answer is that the law of freedom determined these different regimes of race. The laws that made it possible for an enslaved person to become free, and the laws that regulated the lives of free people of color. That story begins with legal traditions back in the 16th century. In particular, the fact that the right to become free was never limited in Cuba and never tied to race or racial identity, but it didn't end there. And the book shows how important were the initiatives of enslaved people themselves, the ways that from the beginning enslaved and free people of African ancestry pushed on the law to claim freedom and carve out new rights of citizenship. And we show that the politics of white men's democracy in the American Republic, where slaveholders had to appeal to non-slaveholding white people, made the position of free people of color especially precarious, so that tying citizenship to whiteness. And we identify the Age of Revolution as a key moment in that divergence. Not always in the ways you might expect. So in some ways, that moment in the late 18th and early 19th century is a moment when freedom is expanding all over the Americas. Populations of free people of color are growing, but key differences between Cuba and the United States are already developing. The expansion of freedom means something very different here in the parts of the country that would become the United States, whereas the community of free people of color in Cuba and in Spanish Louisiana owed its existence to legal understandings and customary practices that are anchored in the old world and in highly stratified societies. By contrast, in Virginia, the expansion of freedom becomes tied to questions of citizenship. And the paradox that in the US, egalitarian democracy goes hand in hand with the expansion of racist practices and ideologies. And that's, I think, one of the ironies we're still dealing with, is the intertwining of slavery and freedom in the United States, of Black enslavement and white freedom and white man's democracy. And so we see in the 19th century a trajectory in which the population of free people of color continues to thrive in Cuba, but in Virginia and Louisiana, they find their churches and militias and schools shut down, the possibility of freedom being closed off, and they even end up in court fighting to remain in the land in which they're born. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ariela. Kristen?
Thank you, Elena. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I just want to thank you all for having me and say that Ariela and Sam have really shown a historical perspective in a wonderful way. And my book really takes hold of the 21st century, specifically about sisterhood across the globe and what that means through a transnational feminist perspective. What still lays in front of the sisterhood in terms of freedom and fighting oppressive practices across the world, and recognizing in transnational feminist perspective that positionality in storytelling is important. This is not a book that I edited alone. There are four of us. Myself, coming from a background of sexual violence, I'm a social worker and active therapist and researcher of sexual violence and trauma in American society, but also at my side with Annalisa Enrile, who's also a social work professor at the School of Social Work and a social justice warrior, a Filipino-American scholar, as well as Shiying Yang, who's a Chinese activist and teaches at Beijing Normal University. And she's a scholar in school bullying, dating violence, and domestic violence in China and Taiwan and Hong Kong. And lastly, with Eugenia Weiss, who's a Latin American researcher and quite frankly, our shepherd in the editorial process of this book. So what we do in this text is try to tell stories, as I mentioned, from different positionalities across the globe. This book spans 14 countries, many bilingual, mostly women writers, talking about how they see oppression and subjugation within their world, their realm, whatever that area may be, and how women are disproportionately affected in their sense of freedom and trying to have their voices heard. So one example is a chapter about how climate change disproportionately affects women in Ghana, and how ecofeminism is an important standpoint when we explore that. Some chapters I personally wrote in this book on college sexual assault, and not just seeding that in what many of us read in the news of American college sexual assault, but throughout the globe, spanning what that looks like in other nations and what similarities and differences there are. The transnational feminist lens of these stories explores theory and practice in the realm of social change and globalization. We really hold on to the intersectionality and decolonization of the knowledge that we have, and try to hold different stories and different perspectives together. To do this, we didn't just tap on other academics, though the four of us editing are academics. We reached out to frontline advocates who are actively fighting, who have been arrested, who were taking a chance in writing about their story in this book. We have NGO organization leaders and advocates who are talking about their mission. And within each chapter, each section, we've divided it into 4 sections. Institutional neglect of women and girls and how that transpires in the 21st century, social media and free choice. We couldn't talk about feminism and 21st century without talking about social media and that term in question of free choice. Political gender equity, and the shape of interpersonal violence within the 21st century. So we have 23 chapters in this book, and we represent 5 continents of issues. And I think it's a nice, of course I like it, it's my book, but I think it's a nice discussion for anybody who's interested in women's studies and international issues.
I want to come back to the transnational issue, because I think that's something obviously that all of you are doing and that is just so critically important. But the first question that I have for all of you is that all of these books, right? I mean, this panel is about citizenship. All your books are about citizenship to some extent, about the ways that citizenship is denied to certain categories of subjects and certain people on the basis of their gender, their race, their age, or their class status, and the ways that these people who are affected by circumscribed citizenship are fighting to have these rights recognized. So I'm interested to know more about the process by which each one of you kind of realized that this category of citizenship and the extent to which your subjects were navigating this unequal or almost citizenship, right, as Sam calls it, or transitional citizenship to some extent, was the thing that was most important, was the primary category of analysis. I think that we can start with Ariela.
Sure. Yeah, we started out interested in this comparative question, right, about how legal regimes of race develop differently in different places that with different legal origins. And the traditional story that's told about the differences between race in the United States and in Latin America often have to do with degree, like the one drop of blood rule, degrees of of blood, the idea that the United States is just black and white, whereas Latin America is multiracial or has lots of gradations of racial identity. And we ended up coming to the conclusion that that was not at all the important difference. Racism in the law exists regardless of the number of categories of racial identity, it turns out, and that what really made the difference between the places we were looking at was this question of how closely whiteness and citizenship became linked, and how possible would it be for a person of African descent to make claims on citizenship. And we found that the relevant aspects of citizenship for the subjects of our story tended to be about the ability to be part of public life. And part of that is political, the ability to vote and to sit on a jury and to muster in the militia. But part of that is also about full kind of participation in public space and public life. And that's what our subjects were really trying to claim.
Thank you so much. Sam?
Sure. So I came to citizenship on the theory that if you looked at citizenship, which is a word that most people have a view of and that matters to officials, you might be able to find a spot where people you wouldn't normally think of as legal actors were getting into the fray and making a difference. And the surprise, once I started looking at some of the fights over citizenship involving Puerto Rico, was some of the uses to which people were putting it. So I had envisioned that citizenship would primarily be about getting the rights, that I associate with it. And what I discovered is that it had very different meanings depending on context. So one of the people I studied was a politician, Federico de Gateau. And he wanted citizenship because he thought that if Puerto Ricans were citizens, that meant Puerto Rico was internal to the United States and would eventually get statehood. Another person I studied was Isabel Gonzalez, a woman who brought a Supreme Court case seeking US citizenship. And her reason for wanting citizenship was less about what rights it would bring her and more about the sense that saying that Puerto Ricans were not citizens was an insult to the island and a way of symbolically holding Puerto Ricans at arm's length. And she was concerned to a substantial degree with being treated as the equal of other Americans. And a third person I studied was a labor leader named Santiago Iglesias. And his view was not that citizenship would bring rights at all, at least not at first. He thought that elites in Puerto Rico were really the pits, and that if Puerto Rico was an independent country, they would exploit the workers. He wanted the federal government in Puerto Rico so that the federal government could stop elites from running things. And so he had this view that what citizenship would bring workers was benevolent dependence, that it would cause them to become subject to federal agencies instead of to local elites, and that this kind of federal paternalism would be good for workers in Puerto Rico who are not yet ready, on his view, to be able to stand up completely. Mattered really differently to different people and in unexpected ways.
Kristen?
I think it's a great question and how it's seated in this book. And I want to visit it to Sam's point about the sort of literal definition of how I, as a social worker, have understood citizenship, but also as sort of a category or question of, do I belong here? And I think that latter question is really well represented throughout this book. We have chapters, for instance, on Indigenous women in the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe Reservation and the suffering that has happened within the United States. And their question you could put, though we don't frame it exactly that way in terms of citizenship. We also have a chapter on refugee mothers who are raising children born of sexual violence as a part of the refugee process in Dutch society, and how that plays out within their mental health and their personal health. But also, I think there's also a question of, do I matter and do I belong within this society? Two things there I want to point out is the conversation of LGBTQ rights in China, right? And do they have the same rights as other citizens in China or not? And the conversation about that, as well as the chapter on Philippine women and human rights defenders and how strong social justice advocates continue to be arrested and voices unheard. So that's how I would answer your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the next thing that I'm interested in knowing about, right, is that all three of these books, I think, point out something really, really interesting, which is that in attempting to make sense of some of the boundaries of citizenship and to figure out, right, who doesn't belong, right, and who does belong. The courts, right, and governments and agencies often create a lot of ambiguity. Sam brings this out really, really explicitly in his book, but I think that Ariela and Kristen, you both also play into kind of the question and the danger, but also the advantage sometimes of legal ambiguity. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more. I think Ariela, maybe you could go first, and then we'll go with Kristen, and then we'll go with Sam since he's the most explicit about it. So,
sure, yeah. So I don't talk explicitly, or we don't talk explicitly in the book about ambiguity, but I would say one of the things we do really emphasize is the ways in which enslaved people take advantage of kind of openings in the law, and often these are unintended consequences that the drafters of particular statutes would not have imagined they could take advantage of. So, for example, in Virginia, in the aftermath of the American Revolution in 1782, they do pass some laws that make it easier for owners of enslaved people to set them free, and for enslaved people to bring freedom suits, in fact, even appointing lawyers for them. So already there's a great expansion of the possibility of becoming free. But one of the ways that they do this is there's a law limiting, banning importation of slaves from other states into Virginia. And that law is entirely about propping up the economy of slavery. It's about propping up the market, keeping prices high by not flooding the market with too many people. And but the penalty for illegal importation is emancipation of the slave. And so enslaved people realize that they can use this to sue for freedom in court, and they start bringing lawsuits saying, my owner brought me into the state illegally. He doesn't have the right paperwork. I should be set free. Hundreds of people gain their freedom this way. Even after the loophole is closed, they keep bringing these cases for decades. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to kind of exploit loopholes and in the law that are sort of not intended for their benefit, but they take opportunities and kind of push on the door to expand those opportunities. I think the other kind of ambiguity I would call attention to is there is this kind of ambiguity about the very status of being a free person of color, which is a legal category in the law, and what kinds of rights are going to be available to people who are in between. They're not white. Often they're not white or in the category of the time Negro. They're not free. They're not enslaved, but they're not entirely free. And so that ambiguity is one that I think actually the enslavers and the slaveholding elites making the laws are always trying to stamp out, but they're not successful in doing so. And so it's an ambiguity that sometimes enslaved people can try to take advantage of.
Right. Yeah. Kristen?
I think it's such a great question. I want to recognize I'm sitting along two legal scholars who can really talk about legal loopholes in a much more sophisticated way than I can. So I just want to acknowledge my positionality here as a social worker and a therapist. And working in sexual violence, I don't know sexual violence without legal ambiguity. There is a lot of loopholes and things. In the book, I would talk about American child marriage. This is an issue right now in our country that each state is having to make a decision on of, do we want children to be married? And when I say children, under the age of 18. It was up until 2 to 3 years ago, it was legal in every state. We now have 3 states that have written state laws to protect minors from being married. But the majority, including California, currently allows minors to be married. And when you really look at the analysis here, there is a law, speaking of the loophole, that you cannot as a minor make a decision to be married, but you can with parent consent. And so we're starting to look at with a deeper way, in a research-oriented way, to understand the stories of what I would argue is a form of gender-based violence in the United States. It predominantly happens to young girls who are being married here. We find that it's forced marriage, the Romeo and Juliet belief that so many people want to talk about is not what we're finding in our research. This is forced marriage, and this is happening in all different communities within the United States. And so that's one example, I think, of how a loophole in our law that many people aren't even aware is occurring is happening. And there's some conversation about American exceptionalism when we start to point out that child marriage is a gender-based violence identified by the United Nations as something to eliminate across the globe. When you bring that into American conversations, it's, it's different here. Women and girls have different opportunities. It's not the same. So anyway, that's my example from this book, and there are others too.
Sam?
That's a great example. Thanks for sharing it. So in my account, basically what happens is the United States annexes a bunch of islands, including the Philippines, and most American politicians and officials think we can't possibly make the Philippines completely part of the United States. And the reason is racism. There's lots of people in the Philippines, and they're thought to be racially degraded. And as a result, a way officials decide must be found to keep them at arm's length. The problem is that the Constitution seems to say that they get to belong. And the answer to this is essentially to duck. So, especially for the Supreme Court justices, there's something very unseemly about declaring that you can simply violate the Constitution. And so instead, they do all of these ambiguous things. They don't quite explain why they're letting something go forward. They say, maybe this is okay, but we're not quite willing to say it out loud yet. And when they finally do allow U.S. empire to go forward under the Constitution, they use these strange terms that reveal their discomfort. So they're going to say that people in the colonies are not necessarily citizens, so they come up with the term the non-citizen national. Some rights won't apply there, and they describe those rights as constitutional rights that are insufficiently fundamental. The places themselves get this mouthful of a name, the unincorporated territory. And what's going on here is that the United States wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be able to become a world power that's an empire, and it wants to adhere to its constitutional and democratic ideals. And that's a circle that can't be squared. And so ambiguity allows people to keep both conceptions or both goals in their head at the same time, and makes it easier not to notice that they're in open conflict.
Thank you so much. So Sam, you pointed to kind of the Philippines, right, as the real example that makes citizenship for annexed territories like really impossible because of racism. And I think that one of the things that, right, all of you point out is this necessity of taking a very transnational approach, right, to your study. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more about why it is, right, that a transnational approach that I think blurs lines and transcends boundaries is particularly important? Kristen, you pointed a lot of this out right in your introduction when you talked about decolonizing the study, and also why there are so many different countries, so many different people, right, that you talk about. So can you start?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think that the main takeaway when I teach my students about transnationalism is that every story matters. And if we scaffold that with the conversation we've already had around citizenship and nationhood, there are many stories within those boundaries and those borders of refugees, of displaced, of asylum seekers, and prisoners and enemies of the state, right? There are lots of stories that we need to pay attention to, and recognizing in my own world, in my own academic studies, the colonized views that I was reading and that I was taught, and making an effort to create room and balance, not just a voice, but a balanced voice of other perspectives and other viewpoints, and other lived experiences that are just as important as mine and those that I had studied before. And so really encompassing the border work, the experiences of everyone that has a story to tell, and the positionality in which each person tells that story is all part of how I see that principle.
Yeah. Sam, can you speak to this next?
Sure. So I'm a legal historian, and I wrote a book about the Constitution. And the Constitution it comes with its own mythology, which is in part a mythology of American exceptionalism, that there's something special about the United States and its Constitution that stands apart from the world, and also a mythology about timelessness, that law is unchanging, that it can look to its past and derive what to do about novel and new situations. And sort of looking across borders is a way to pierce those mythologies to some degree, that in fact law is changing all the time, and it is very much of the world. It is not something that is apart and able to operate on its own. And in fact, a major source of shocks to law is the rest of the world. And so by looking at an example where a place from outside the United States was brought in, and the people in that place began litigating and making constitutional arguments, and then seeing how the Constitution changed in the years that followed, is a way to try to get to a truer history of the US Constitution that takes account for the ways that law responds to and is changed by all the forces around it, and exists in a world that includes many forces that operate on law that are beyond law's formal jurisdiction.
Thank you. Ariela?
Yeah, those are both very interesting. And in particular, I think all of us were really raised with this kind of American exceptionalism story that has been so important in the teaching of American history and American law. And of course, we've seen a discussion of it in recent politics as well. It's a very dominant view. And to me as well, moving the lens outward really challenges some of that. So to me, the way I learned as a student, the history of race and slavery was very parochial in its focus on the United States. And there were many aspects of the law of slavery and of racial ideology that were taught as though they were uniquely US phenomena. And what you realize when you widen the lens and look, and in our book, we tried to look both comparatively and transnationally. So I'll say something about that in a minute. But just when you widen the lens, you realize that, in fact, plantation slave societies and the laws that regulated them remarkably similar across the Americas. So that's one of the reasons we didn't end up writing a book that was just comparing the law of slavery, because it would have said very similar everywhere. The ways in which enslavers tried to exercise social control over people to quell rebellion is remarkably uniform across the Americas. The ideology of white supremacy is also circulating all over the Atlantic. Everyone, enslavers all across the Americas are sharing in the same new racial pseudoscience in the 19th century. They're taking part in the same circulation of ideas. And yet we did find these important differences. So by looking comparatively, it helped us to see what in particular is unique in these particular places at certain moments, and not to assume this kind of general exceptionalism. And then the second thing I would say is, unlike comparativists who wrote about the United States and Latin America in the mid-20th century, of which there were some very important historians who did that and did some very important work, but they tended to see these places as kind of hermetically sealed separate jurisdictions that you could compare, whereas we recognized that there was an incredible flow of ideas and of people among the places we were looking at. So I'll just end with two examples. One is that when Louisiana changed hands from the French to the Spanish, the new governor of New Orleans, Governor O'Reilly, he has this Irish name, but he's Spanish. He comes from Havana to New Orleans. He brings with him a militia of free men of color. And they immediately spread the news to the people of color of New Orleans about these new about Spanish legal practices of claiming freedom. And you can immediately see people making those claims in Spanish law within a few weeks of their arrival. And the same thing happens after the Haitian Revolution. You have a flow of people from Haiti to Havana to New Orleans, and so there's a lot of circulation of people and of ideas that I think we just an earlier generation of historians was less paying attention to.
Yeah, on that note, right, the fact that past generations of historians, and particularly, right, in your case, Ariela and Sam, legal historians, weren't really paying attention to the individual, right? The power of people who are just not normally considered to be legal actors, right? Kristen, you said something that I thought was just so incredibly compelling, which was this idea that every single story matters. And as I was reading your volume, it was the individual stories that I found myself really like kind of putting my hands over my mouth and gasping, because they were just so compelling in you know, bringing you into what appears to be such a dense web of structure and bureaucracy and policy and law. Can you guys speak a little bit more about, I mean, Kristen, I think that you've spoken quite a bit about why the individual story matters, but Sam and Ariela, can you tell us a little bit more about your decision to focus on, to take a different tack from past legal historians, right, and to focus on the person? Sam, maybe you could start.
Sure. So for me, there's two reasons to do this. One is it's just a lot more fun. So learning about individuals in the past, getting to know them well, getting inside their lives, reading all their letters, that's like my idea of a historian's good time. And I think it makes for a more interesting read for your audience when there's characters they can relate to and follow. But there's also a methodological point to doing it, which is that when you look at things very closely, you're able to see how they worked in greater detail than when you try to take in the whole picture at once from 1,000 feet up. And what that means is you're able to perceive dynamics that otherwise might be invisible to you. The challenge, of course, is knowing, are you looking at something that just happened that one time, a weird one-off event, or are you found an example that's a telling one that illuminates larger, more universal processes? And that's an interesting and difficult problem sometimes, but without looking closely, you never get that sense of texture, and you never get the sense of what the history was like for the people who lived it. How did they experience it? How did they walk through the constraints and the opportunities that surrounded them? And so those were the main reasons that focusing on individuals seemed like a sensible choice to me.
Ariela?
Well, I second everything Sam says. I definitely think it's more fun. I think it also has to do, for a legal historian, with how we define what is the law and who makes the law. And I think, I started writing this kind of history because I wanted to show my belief that law is not the statutes that are written in the books, and it's not just the opinions that come down from high courts, that law can be made by ordinary individuals in those interactions with institutions. And even in the stories we tell about law, the claims that we make on law in our ordinary daily lives. And so that seemed to me to be the most likely way to get at the voices and the ideologies and the understandings and the legal consciousness of people at the lowest level of society in terms of their social or legal status. How could we get at the people who weren't writing letters and preserving those letters the way upper class elite people did, who weren't getting to write in the legislative journals or these other sources that we have for elite people. And I found that trial records and testimonies, that what's written in the claims made in these petitions and freedom suits actually allow you to hear maybe at some remove, but hear the voices of enslaved people themselves. And the other thing I think is that as I worked in that kind of records, especially at the local level, you realize that often the pronouncements of the high courts and the statutes that are in the books are not being followed at all on the ground, or that people are pushing against them and kind of expanding and claiming greater rights through customary practices that will eventually end up codified in the law, but aren't at the time. So just to take one example, in Cuba, there is a practice of self-purchase on an installment plan called coartación. And the idea is that having paid a fraction of one's price, that then your price is fixed, and if you're able to earn the rest of the money, the owner must sell at that, must give you your freedom at the agreed upon price. And people who have been through this process are known as coartado or coartada, and coartado slaves push on this practice to gain additional rights by saying, for example, the child in my womb should also be free in the same proportion. If I have already paid half my price, I should own half myself and half my labor and be paid wages for half my time for going forward. I should be able to carry paper and allow someone else to make this purchase if they're able to come up with half the price. All of these additional rights were nowhere in the books, but in practice, enslaved and coartada people push on the law in order to make that real. And as they win those claims, eventually those end up codified. So to me, what's exciting is finding the law that ordinary people are making in their daily lives.
Kristen, did you have anything to add about the importance, right, of every story?
I just see myself, even as the editor of this book, as a constant learner. I think the stories that are just being told today are new. There's so many new stories that are being told today that continually open my eyes and my heart to the world that we live in, and in regards to this book, the struggle that women and girls have in being seen and valued in their society. And so as a social worker, you know, I study stories and I value them very much. And, you know, I appreciate the forum to be able to talk about this book here, and Oxford to give us the forum to write this book, to have other people read about it.
So I want to now turn to some of the audience questions, which are mostly about our present times. And so, Kristen, in your chapter on revenge pornography, right, and the sharing of non-consensual sexual images, you talk about this idea of sequelae, right, of the afterlives of trauma in the lives of victims. And I think that all of you speak in some way to the afterlives of laws and policies and individual actions. And so our audience members want to know, right, in particular, of course, you know, some of our audience members want you to solve every problem of racism, misogyny, and marginalization. But we have a question from Sahar, which is that besides our history of slavery and anti-immigrant legislation, what do you believe is the root cause of modern day racism and beliefs of white superiority, I assume, in America? Big question. So, I don't know, Ariela, do you want to take a stab at this first?
Sure. I mean, of course, as a historian, I am going to look to the history, but I actually do believe, and part of the argument in the book is that that the clearest through line really is not as directly from uh, the law of slavery, but in fact the law of freedom to the kinds um, of anti-Black racism in the law that we see in the post-Civil War period, even leading up to the present. That is, that if you look at the Black codes that are passed immediately after the Civil War, if you look, in fact, at immigration restriction and deportation and nativist legislation, it really mirrors the kinds of restrictions that were put on free people of color before the Civil War, and because it's based on race rather than status, that carries forward. And so to me, it's that link between whiteness and citizenship that was forged before the Civil War that has been this through line in our legal and constitutional history that's been so hard to break, right? That's the link we're trying to break now, is that presumption of a connection between citizenship and whiteness. And I think, it's sadly, we still see that today. We see, the vice president-elect, just like President Obama before her, having her citizenship challenged because she's a woman of color. There are so many examples, I think, that we can see, but even in the kind of criminalization of Blackness, the treatment of Black people in the criminal law, I think we're still seeing that we haven't been able to break that connection today.
Sam or Kristen, do you have any?
I appreciate the question, especially in 2020, and when I'm positive and hopeful about a sea change in this nation. And I'm thinking about Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. I'm thinking about Ibram X. Kendi's book on how to be anti-racist. And just generally just how racism exists in this country because it's in all of us, right? And just acknowledging that we have to work hard each day within ourselves of questioning how we know what we know and why we do what we do. And moving forward with that question of the history that we teach our children in elementary schools, the psychological theory I teach my students in social work and social justice circles, and even my own conceptualization related to this book of feminism and the stories that were told and the stories that weren't told, and make a conscious effort every day as a commitment to anti-racist work in American society.
Yeah, Sam?
Sure. Those are great answers, so I don't have a ton to add. I guess I'll make two brief points. One is that in addition to immigration and slavery and its descendant, domestic racism, whiteness, as the privileges of whiteness were also used to help justify the dispossession of American Indians and the creation and maintenance of colonies. And so those are sort of additional causes and buttresses for our modern moment. And I suppose I take the question in part to be, all this bad stuff happened a long time ago. Why is it still dragging us down? And I think the question in some ways answers or contains its own answer, which is that racism and white supremacy have proven to be very sticky, that they go on intergenerationally, they are politically powerful and difficult to excise. And if I knew precisely what you could do to get rid of them, right, that would be fantastic. But I think in some ways, there is this reality that we live with our past in this area, and that's one of the major problems of our moment.
So in this moment, right, this last election in which, right, we saw how divided the country is, right? Some of our audience members want to know whether, right, and I know, Sam, you just said, right, it's hard to know exactly what the thing to do is, right, to kind of move forward. But one of the things that one of our audience members, Alexis, wants to know, right, do you think that these issues of racism, misogyny, homophobia, right, class conflict, ageism, et cetera, can really change under the Biden administration? And I would add, I would clarify, right, this a little bit. Does it matter what administration this is under, right? Is this really a partisan matter? Or is this something that, right, is so ingrained in America as to be, right, a nonpartisan issue? But also, how do we affect change? How do we support marginalized communities? And how do we move forward starting now? And I think, Kristen, if you could start, because I know that you work a lot in terms of social advocacy and activism.
Yeah, that question really brings me to an introductory theory that we teach our social work students of critical race theory. And one of the fundamental tenets of critical race theory is that racism is endemic in America. It is part of the fabric, and how we as social workers can begin, and social justice advocates can begin to work to dismantle whatever we can to create true equality and equal human rights, right, in this nation. The work that I do at the Keck Human Rights Clinic is with those seeking asylum in this country, and they are survivors of human rights abuses, and yet we see in 2020 how what has been considered for decades acceptable reasons to seek asylum, those reasons being stripped away. And a lot of people smarter than me will say that that has to do with a lot of the isms that currently exist in our culture, and therefore being acted out in this process of protecting human beings from human rights abuse. And so I don't have an answer, but I certainly have a cause that I'm doing to try to chip away at that. And I try to encourage my students to find a cause as well to do the same.
Yeah, Sam?
Sure. So I don't think the fact that Biden won the election means that utopia is around the corner. These are hard problems, and they've been around a very long time, and it's going to take a long time and a lot of work to make things better. But I don't think that means we should be hopeless. So, for instance, racism has long depended on law to operate. It has been sustained by law. Law has been part of what made it a useful approach at various moments in US history. And law has also been effective at times at shutting it down. The Reconstruction was a moment of enormous possibility and enormous gains. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act fundamentally changed things about the country. And so I guess what I take from this is that it's worth engaging in trying to make our institutions better, because that makes a difference. And making a difference, making things better, probably will not solve the problem completely, certainly won't anytime soon. But one lesson from recent history is that things can be worse and things can be better. And we have, each of us as individuals, the power to be involved and try to make things better. And that has real consequences. It's not, right, it's not just whistling in the wind. Depending who wins elections, there are lots and lots of people whose lives change, sometimes whose lives hang in the balance. And so these are things worth fighting for and worth spending time on.
Ariela?
Yeah, I just want to build on what Sam was just saying, and to emphasize the power of social movements and political movements. Reconstruction, which transformed our Constitution, was the result of the power of the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement and the radical Republicans who carried that forward. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965 would never have happened had it not been for the mobilization of Black movements in the South, interracial movements like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and all of the people who marched. And what gives me hope today is what we saw over this summer, the outpouring of protest in all 50 states and hundreds of towns and cities around our country in the movement for Black lives, a movement that had been organizing and working for the last 6 years, and that organizing bore fruit this summer. I think we saw more people than in an interracial movement than I would have imagined in the streets, and I see the results of this election as in part the culmination of that and of a lot of on-the-ground organizing by people like Stacey Abrams and other Black women activists, really working on the ground to fight voter suppression, to fight for voting rights. Historian Martha Jones has a wonderful new book this year called The Vanguard, about the way Black women have been fighting for voting rights for the last 150 years. And so if there is hope in this moment, I think it's that we can build on the power of that movement in this election, and the kind of consciousness raising that happened this summer, and not let that be just a kind of flash in the pan, but something that leads to a continued fighting for a third Reconstruction, which is what I think we really need.
Thank you so much. And so we are actually out of time. I want to thank everybody so much for tuning into this really important conversation. And thank you so much to Sam Erman, Ariela Gross, and Kristen Zaleski for your time. One more final reminder, if you want to be like me and have all the books at your fingertips right here, please support your local bookstore, but you can also buy all of them at bookshop.org. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you, Elena.